Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now, let me introduce my guest today.
Good evening from our studio in Amsterdam. I'm extremely excited because I'm going to be doing a TBLI talk with a very dear friend and old friend who's been in the space, in the Cleantech space, longer than anyone. We've had a little bit of a hiccup with our timing, but this is all being taped, so we will make sure everyone is shared this. If you have any comment, just type in the comment area and I will address that. So Wal Van Lierop is the CEO, and I think you were one of the early partners, or actually one of the founders of Chrysalix, which was one of the early stage Cleantech Venture Capital organization based in Canada. He's going to share with us what has he learned. Has Cleantech actually delivered on its promises, or is it the only thing that's delivering on its promises compared to all of the ESG announcement? Wal, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening in Europe, this coffee time in Vancouver, Canada. I was the founder of Chrysalix in 2001, but I've actually been in Cleantech for a very long time. I started out as a university professor in environmental technology and economics. And in the late 1970s, yes, I am an old guy, I was working at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, where at the time, a lot of people of the Club of Rome came together. And so I played baseball with Dennis Meadows at the time. And so I did a first book on how ecology and economy should work together in the early 80s, together with an ecologist. That was published by Elsevier, and you can still find it in most university libraries. But in the mid-80s, I realized, the world is not ready for this stuff, and I need to go where I can have impact. And so I went to the dark side and joined McKinsey. And for the next 8 years, I was working as a consultant for McKinsey, primarily advising large international energy-intensive industries about what they should be doing. And my wife is from Canada, and in late 95, she said to me, I want to go home. She lived with me in Amsterdam, close to where you are living. And so she said, if you don't join me, send me a postcard once in a while. And so I packed up and we moved to Canada, where I became the vice president of strategy and business development for, at the time, one of the largest Canadian energy companies. So I saw the energy world from yet another perspective than a university professor or a international consultant. And I started to work on a corporate venturing group in that large energy corporation, but then we merged that with Duke Energy in 2001. And instead of joining Duke, I decided to start with Chrysalix. So I do have a rather unique perspective in the energy world and when it comes to clean tech. The perspective of a venture capitalist with Chrysalix, the perspective of an executive in a large energy company, the perspective of a international consultant with McKinsey, and the perspective of a university professor. So I sometimes say, gee, I indeed have about 50 years of experience in the clean tech space. And now I lost you. You are on mute.
I remember actually going with you on some road shows in Europe, and I remember it was tough going because clean tech at that time, this is more than 20 years ago, was not big. And I remember I used to say to investors, well, we're looking for, funds that have a 10-year track record. And I would say, wait 10 years, there'll be plenty of them. So there's and when you started, it must have been really, really hard getting investors to support a first-time fund in early stage. How did you overcome that? How did you get the first investors on board?
So you're absolutely right. When we started Chrysalix, it was in the summer of 2001. Now, go back to that moment for a moment. 2001, the internet bubble in Silicon Valley had just popped. We had 9/11, and we had the Enron scandal. And you're trying to do what? So no financial institution was interested in a fund, but it were some strategics. I had done a lot of work for Shell, and Shell thought we're going to go to a hydrogen economy pretty soon. And so thought BASF and Mitsubishi and Ballard Power. And they backed us with our first fund under the condition that we would focus on fuel cells and hydrogen. Because they thought that by now, 2021, everybody would drive a fuel cell and hydrogen car. And of course, that has not materialized. And why did it materialize? Because clean tech developed in a totally different way than people expected. In 2001, like I said, the internet had just popped, and everybody in Silicon Valley thought, where is the next big shiny thing? Oh, clean tech. And so everybody from Kleiner Perkins to Sequoia went into clean tech. But it was an industry that was totally different than what they expected. They expected that it will be the same trick as we did in the internet age. And that is you develop a technology, it goes to one trough of serious technical problems, but when you have survived that, you just push things into the market. Now, of course, the internet was a new industry. Clean tech was focused on old industries. And it doesn't work like that. There are at least two values of that. Once you have proven the technology, you have to prove it at scale in old industries that are change resistant. And so that is very difficult. And so it's no wonder that when all these Silicon Valley-based VCs tried for a few years to do clean tech, by the end of that decade, they said, this is not a VC play. You cannot make money in clean tech. And massively, they all stepped out of the clean tech space. And it became very difficult to raise money for quite a while. Of course, what did not happen is that some of the early investments, in particular in solar, depended too much on subsidies and went belly up, with most notable, of course, the name Solyndra, the company that was backed very significantly by the Obama administration and still went belly up. Now, while many VCs left the space because they thought you cannot make money here, Or while others said, well, there's only money to be made in the later stage. So once these technologies have developed and proven themselves work well and scalable in the market, we thought, there must be opportunities in the early stage. And so we remained on the early stage, and we did that together with primarily industrial investors. Industrial investors that still had a need, still realized that over time they need to do two things, become digital and become clean. And so we worked hand in hand with them to see what their burning platforms were, and if we could build companies that solved their primary solutions. So we built a unique ecosystem, and that ecosystem today helps our early stage cleantech companies to scale up in important markets. Let me stop here for a moment.
But you chose early stage company. You didn't choose late stage. So you were a first time fund in a new market doing the most difficult group. And you still were able to get investors, I mean, corporate investors initially, and then later other institutional investors. But it's, that must have been incredibly difficult, finding early stage and, supporting them. It doesn't go according to plan. It's always worse or better.
Oh, no, this is not for the faint of heart. And I had a discussion with Mike Eckert 2 years ago. Mike Eckert, who did an institution comparable to yours until about 10 years ago, and then joined Citibank. And he said, for all the VCs in this space that have survived, and that are only a few, there are many who came to Mike and said, I put my pension money in this, in trying to develop a VC space. And that signals something that was also important in that early stage, not just on the VC side, but also on the company side. There were many people who were very enthusiastic about cleaning the world, but were at the same time very naive about how to do this. And so we did not have the right people to run companies that could play crucial roles in, for example, the energy industry or the mining industry. So it took at least another 10, 15 years for the entrepreneurial talent that can really build and scale up successful companies was ready to enter this space. But today, that is totally different. Now you see the same entrepreneurial talent that you will see in any other industry entering the cleantech space. And with that, entering the challenge of reorganizing and cleaning up many of the traditional industries. We at Chrysalix, that is what we do. We try to ensure that there will be solutions that will help traditional industries like mining, transportation, energy, chemicals, construction, to be well positioned to become net zero by 2050, which is not a small feat.
No, I can imagine, but ESG claims, $30-40 trillion going into ESG, but if that's true, why are the list of problems of climate, carbon, food security, etc., so big? So either the money's not going in or definitions are skewed. Has Cleantech done a better job than the ESG liquid space in actually addressing climate?
Well, we can have a long debate on ESG. You said the money is going in. Let's start with ESG, and the money is going out. The thing here is that what we are seeing with ESG is that most funds that do that only get their money out of the traditional oil and gas industry, the traditional fossil fuel industry. And then they have made significant returns by just putting money in the top Silicon Valley companies. Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. I mean, they did not do anything more. So it's not surprising that I saw yesterday a astonishing study by a Cleantech consultant saying that 75% of the ESG funds are not being trusted about that they're doing anything positive.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's a lot of greenwashing there. If you ask me what should happen in the ESG area, is we should have a very simple ranking system. And that is, if you take money out of the fossil fuel industry and you put it only into the Microsofts, the Apples of this world, you still should get a negative ranking. If you don't do anything, then maybe you get a neutral ranking. But only when you start investing in what I call the easy proven stuff in the meantime in Cleantech, like for example solar and wind, you get a small positive ranking. But if you start working on solutions that we really will need in order to achieve net zero by 2050, then you get a much more positive ranking, and that could should then refer to solutions in carbon capture, hydrogen, maybe even nuclear fusion. Solutions that we really need because increasingly people start to realize that if we want to achieve net zero by 2050, we will not be able to do that with just solar, wind, batteries, and biomass. We have achieved a lot with that. And maybe you can do 50% of the energy transformation with these existing technologies. But when it comes to powering megacities, or when it comes to ensuring that you can solve the energy needs of aluminum smelters, the concrete industry, steel, and so on, we still need something totally different. And so we actually need that ESG money. But if the ESG money is just about taking money out of fossil fuels, it should still get a negative annotation. And maybe it should get a stick in the form of an extra tax. Whereas when you put money actively into either solar and wind or a step further into these new technologies that we will need for net zero 2050, then you should get an extra subsidy. And by doing that, we will stimulate people to do a little more than taking money out of fossil fuels.
You invested, as I think I remember, you were one of the early investors in a technology that was going to take decades to become commercially viable, nuclear fusion. I think you were one of the investors in General Fusion.
That's correct, and yeah. I still am.
So I mean, when did you first invest in that?
2008.
So
I am in my 13th year in General Fusion.
And they're building a commercial plant in the UK, as far as I understood.
So what is happening in the fusion space is extremely interesting. The saying was always, fusion is 20 years out, and it will always be 20 years out. What we see now is, and that was based also because there were only a few large-scale fusion projects, the most important one being ITER in France. So ITER is a 20 billion plus financed science project. that will work, and that is scheduled to be operational by 2045. So that's still 24 years out. Now, in the meantime, what we have seen is that more than 30 commercial fusion companies popped up. And maybe 5 or 6 are really viable. And they are moving towards a situation where they think that by 2030, maybe as early as 2028, they will put the first commercial plants in operation. So the most significant companies in that area are TIA, Tri-Alpha, out of California, Commonwealth, and maybe a few others, but then there is General Fusion. I'm not going to speak for the others, but General Fusion has now tested out all the individual components of their fusion machine. And they now need to bring it together, like integrate all the systems, the parts of the system that have been proven into the overall machine. And that is what they are doing currently in the UK. So Killam in the UK, supported by with significant financial support from the UK government and supported by the UK Atomic Energy Association, they are building a test machine. That test machine should be operational by 2025. It will prove that fusion will work. It is not a power plant. The power plant, the first commercial power plant, we hope to build by 2030, maybe as early as 2028. Why is it important that we can hit those timeframes? And that is Paris. Under the Paris Agreement, many utilities all over the world, but in particular in Europe, are committed to have to retire their coal-fired power plants by 2030, 2035. So there is a unique market circumstance opening up. And if and there is an enormous need. I mean, this morning I had a discussion with EDF, and they are getting very interested also in this area. So how can we solve the problems of many countries and utilities that need to have a solution for the retirement of their coal-fired power plants? What you see in many European countries, as well as in Korea and in Japan, that people are saying, gee, there is no solution yet. Maybe there is a solution in hydrogen. So there's a lot of activity to start a hydrogen economy. And there will certainly be a role for hydrogen. But let's think about that for a moment. So if you want to have green hydrogen, because it needs to be green if we want to be net zero by 2050. You want to have green hydrogen, then even hydrogen generation from natural gas combined with carbon capture is not enough. So, and you have to start thinking about what are the sources of green hydrogen. In Europe, they say offshore wind in the North Sea. Now, if you look at the harbor of Rotterdam, they have 3 coal-fired power plants. It's probably true that if you build out the entire North Sea with offshore wind power, you still don't have enough to replace the capacity of these 3 massive coal-fired power plants in the harbor of Rotterdam. So I may say, well, now we're going to ship hydrogen in from Morocco. Mm-hmm. Solar-generated hydrogen, and develop special ships and put it in the existing infrastructure in the harbor of Rotterdam or elsewhere. You start doing the cost analysis of this, it becomes a very costly exercise. And so nuclear could really be that. There will be a role, maybe even of nuclear together with hydrogen, because nuclear as a source of green hydrogen, hydrogen that maybe can be used for some heavy industries where electricity is not an option, like steel manufacturing or aluminum. I mean, so for net zero 2050, we still have a number of very important questions. And that is what we are working ourselves through, because everybody close to having to find solutions, not just ESG investors sitting in Amsterdam or London or New York, but everybody close to having the need for a solution realizes that what I said before, we have achieved a lot with wind and solar and batteries and biomass, and that's here to stay, and that's fantastic. But in order to ensure that we can power mega cities and that we can power heavy industry, we need more. We need new solutions. And so things like hydrogen, fusion are absolutely essential. And I hope that the fact that companies like General Fusion have now left the lab and are in the engineering phase, I hope that they can prove indeed later in this decade that they can put in place the first commercial fusion plants.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around. You invested in 2008. You're going to have a working plan 2030. Most VC funds have not a 25-year period. How do you keep your investors on board if you're waiting almost 23 years to even see anything?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is, of course, something that timing is a horrible thing. The most investors have a model, most VCs have a model of a 10-year fund, maybe with 2-3 year extensions. And we are now sitting exactly there. And of course, we come from a period like even 2 years ago that many investors said, gee, probably fusion will still be 20 years out. Why don't you get rid of the investment in General Fusion?
Yeah.
Now people start thinking, hey, this is becoming very interesting. A company like Trialpha currently already has a valuation of just shy of 5 billion. General Fusion is significantly cheaper, but so the few hundred millions that have been invested in General Fusion today have a much higher carrying value and have a prospect of we would do an IPO. A SPAC is not possible any longer. SPACs, of course, that world has I'm not saying that it ended, but it is very difficult to even do a SPAC for a normal company since the beginning of September. But if we could do an IPO or even a significant next round of financing that will provide the financial investors that stepped into General Fusion with us in the early days to get out at a very handsome uptick on their investment. But of course, if they would stay a little longer and could be there for the launch of the first commercial plant later this decade, then the sky is the limit. Because let there be no mistake, if, and I say if we can realize commercial fusion early in the next decade, then the energy world will totally change. We will have safe, cheap, abundant baseload, clean. It will mean affordable power anytime, anywhere. So this is a total game changer. And I'm actually totally surprised in the evolution of where this is going that a number of oil and gas companies, in their need to go to this transformation to a cleaner industry, are not taking options.
Yeah.
I mean, I should correct myself. ENEL has taken an option in Commonwealth. But I mean, some of these companies would today still be for sale for a few billion. It's like looking back to the automotive industry and Tesla 10 years ago. Why didn't, I mean, we know that there was discussion between Ford and Tesla, and it didn't happen, and the rest is history. And so, as you know, that most of the time the disruptor in an industry will come from outside. And you now see the disruptors knocking on the door of the energy industry. If I were a leader, if I were Ben van Beurden, I would at least take an option.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe it or not, in a previous life, I used to work on oil rigs. I'm definitely guilty. Worked for 2 years in the U.S., North Sea, Iran. I was just surprised that I actually found anything because I found so many incompetent people working in the energy sector. But, you know, it's easy for them. They open a valve and they get their bonuses. So this is a whole different type of infrastructure. Coming back to the funds, how many funds have you launched since Chrysalix has been around?
We are now working on our 5th fund.
So, okay, 5 funds.
Yeah.
What is the total amount that you raised?
Oh, the total amount that I raised. That
was in the
it's in the order of $500 million.
Okay. So, and this was all early stage.
It's all early stage. Well, there's also a reason why we do early stage. Because if you come in later stage, you very often can capture only a small part of the ownership of the company. And that may be attractive from a risk management point of view. But if you own 3% of a company at the moment of exit, in the app and the original internet space, where you would have very small initial investments, and then you would do an IPO, and the invested capital was maybe up to 100 million, and then it would jump directly to a few billion. Then 3% ownership would move the dial at the fund level. When you are in a cleantech space, most of these companies to date have been acquired by large traditional industries. Now, these acquisition values that you would get at exit are much lower than if you do an IPO in a new industry. So in that case, 3 or 4% ownership at the exit moment of a young company does not move the dial at the fund level. And so what we are saying is, in order to ensure that we get significant return potential, we go in very early and then capture 20-30% of the company. And then over time, we dilute ourselves down so that at the moment of exit, we still have about 15%. And that will be meaningful for the fund. I'm not saying that I mean, it is nice to have a small part in the company and have an exit of a few million, as we have seen multiple times in the cleantech space. But big exits are really what it is all about in order to ensure that you have a attractive return for your limited partners. And that is one of the things that drove us to early stage.
Do you know how many exits you've done over the years?
Not exactly, but I mean, it must be more than a dozen, and 5 or 6 that really counted, and 5 or 6 that are now lined up to become really big payouts and platform technologies. I mean, like one company that is very interesting in that regard is maybe Swante. Swante is
oh yeah, I know them.
Carbon capture company.
Yeah, I know
So
them.
Swante is doing point of source carbon capture. So carbon capture at the end of a smokestack. And in its current early commercial projects with the likes of Synovus, but also the cement company Lapart, they are now doing carbon capture around $60 a ton. So that's starting to look very attractive, in particular if you look at the 45Q subsidy regulation in the US and combine that with the California low fuel standards. So it's almost in the money. But now 2 things are happening. So one is 45Q under the infrastructure bill that is currently going to the U.S. House and Senate. 45Q is going to $85. So that makes it way more attractive for Swante. And then on the other hand, the bigger projects that Swante is working on is driving their cost to $30. So what we see here is the beginning of a commercial carbon market. Very interesting. And so it's not surprising that some of the big project finance companies, the Goldmans and others of this world, who in the past 6-7 years made a bundle in utility scale solar projects in the US, are now knocking on the door of the Swantes of this world and said, gee, can we line ourselves up for the next projects that you are doing? So this is point of source carbon capture. Then there is, of course, the direct air carbon capture. It's companies like Carbon Engineering and in particular also Climeworks with their facilities in Iceland are working on. And what is becoming clear now is that while direct air capture is still sitting at a cost of north of $500 per ton, if we start embedding the Swante filters in the systems of, in particular, companies like Climeworks, we very quickly lower their cost to below $200 a ton. Maybe there's even a path $200 per ton. So maybe over time, we now see an evolving pattern to even reach a point where direct air capture can be attractive from a financial point of view.
Guy wanted to know, what is the typical initial size of investment in early stage that you do?
Oh, so what we do is anything between $500,000 to $3 million for our first investment. But then, of course, we stay with the company, and typically over time we could do up to $15 million on our own. But that, by the time we have invested a total of $15 million, typically the last rounds that we participate in will be very significant rounds. Like with Swante, for example, we completed a $100 million oversubscribed round earlier this year, and we only participated for a little bit.
Going forward, I mean, Vancouver had temperatures that you would find in Kuwait, British Columbia had very high temperatures this past year in the summer. I mean, really hot. Do we have enough time for all of these things to come together to actually make a difference, or is it just too late and we should just shift to adaptation?
Well, we can never say it's too late. I have my first grandson. We need to ensure that we create a world that is good for them. It's not the world of our grandparents. It's a totally different world. And we probably, given where we are, we need to race really as fast as possible. We need to accelerate investment and all kind of actions to ensure that we leave this world in a reasonable way for our grandchildren. Mm-hmm. Having said that, we are at a point that adaptation is also becoming very, very important. You referred to British Columbia. So the north of British Columbia, and basically the Arctic zone all over the world, but in particular in Russia and in Canada, is what I call ground zero for climate change. I mean, we talk about an average of hopefully staying at 1.5 or maybe 2. But let it be no mistake. In the Arctic Circle, we are already sitting at 3.1. We have melting permafrost, where you have, as a result of that, rapidly runoff of valuable water from glaciers, and you have a ticking time bomb in the form of the methane that will be released from this melting permafrost. So we need to work on that, but as well, we may need different actions that ensure that we adapt to what is happening in that area anyway. Like, I can imagine that we start to build massively water pipelines from northern BC to southern California. We have gas pipelines that span that distance, but we should take water away from where it is a problem, because all that water through the Mackenzie River and elsewhere end up in the Arctic Sea, and there it causes more of a problem. The outflow of the Mackenzie River alone into the Arctic Sea has increased by almost 100% since 50 years ago. So we let fresh water that we could use elsewhere, we let it run off and contribute further to the problem in the Arctic Sea. Whereas if we could turn it around, we could bring water where we need it in the southwest of the United States, which is forecasted to because of climate change, to become drier and drier and drier. And of course, if we would do this type of adaptation infrastructure work, we can also engage the people in provinces like Alberta, where we need to find solutions to replace the work for people that they traditionally did in the oil and gas industry. And you're a pipeline builder, you don't care. It's a water pipeline, it's an oil pipeline, it's a gas pipeline, we build pipelines. It would ensure meaningful work in these areas, and it would ensure that all noses are going in the same direction, the direction of trying to find either new technologies or adaptations to create the world our children will need.
Okay. Beata had a question, my general counsel. Which project are you most proud of? Which is most impactful, or which has a potential to be most impactful? Is it General Fusion?
Well, if General Fusion becomes successful, or if any of the competitors of General Fusion becomes successful, we leapfrog to clean energy net zero by 2050. That has a major impact, not just in the energy industry, but having clean, safe, cheap, abundant baseload available anywhere, anytime. That changes everything. So that is fantastic. But I mean, the carbon capture company, Swante, a company called MindSense, totally changing the mining industry. I mean, mining is very important. Most people in cities don't realize that, but we will need the mining industry for the energy transition. A lot of new technologies in the cleantech space start with digging up something, whether it from copper to rare earths. I mean, in your batteries, in windmills, and EVs. I mean, you need mining products. So we have a company called MindSense. What does MindSense do? MindSense brings sensors to the scoop of these very big excavators that in one scoop take a lot of rock, bigger than your entire room where you're sitting in currently. And then in real time, the operator, he or she, can see what is in that scoop. And if it is worthwhile to bring it up from the mine and drive it down the road to the mill for crushing and further processing, or if they just send it aside or send it to the waste pile. And by doing this, the economics improve tremendously. If you improve the selection of waste rock in that process by just 30%, in a small mine, you very quickly get 30 million directly to the bottom line per mine per year. In a bigger mine, a big copper zinc mine, you should think about 200 million annually to the bottom line. And not only that, there is, because of this, a significant reduction of the use of energy, particularly diesel. Diesel is currently still, I mean, the mining industry is the number one taker of diesel oil in North America today. So you reduce the energy demand in the mining industry very significantly, and you reduce the demand for water. For every barrel of oil that you use in the mining industry, you use about 6 to 7 barrels of water. Mining is a very water-intensive industry. So the environmental impact of the mining industry, which we need, like I said, for the energy transition, is very, very dramatic. Very dramatic.
We have quite a few questions, but I'm not going to be able to take them because you had a hard stop in about 2 minutes, in about 1 minute, actually. So I want to leave the final for you. What can this audience do that's watching now or watching later on YouTube or Facebook or the replay? What can they do to help you?
Well, the most important thing is to realize that we need to accelerate actions. It's about acceleration of real actions. And for that, we need to focus. I mean, it's when I was a young consultant at McKinsey, we very often did the cost-saving analysis. And always somebody would start and say, gee, why don't we start with photocopying both sides? That is not what we want. There is a lot in the ESG space that is small, little nice to have. We need to focus on the big bites. The big bites. We need to ensure that we get ESG and impact investors to put money behind these big things, whether it is hydrogen or carbon capture or nuclear fusion. And then, last but not least, we need real accountability. We need to ensure that people are responsible, that when companies say we're going to be net zero by 2050, that year by year, we know what they're going to do, and that the people involved with that have a minimum of 25% of their remuneration impacted by success or not. So we need accountability. And I actually say that accountability should not only be there for the industrial people involved, corporate people involved, but it should also be for the policymakers. It should also be for ministers that wave the flag and say, we're going to do this. But the thing, of course, is that we come from an era where we promised and promised and promised and never met these promises. And so we need to focus and we need to have accountability.
Thank you. I'm going to take a group selfie with everyone who's here. Thank you all very much. My apologies about the time. We changed our clocks in the Netherlands last week, and I completely got messed up about the time. This is all being taped, so just wave to the camera and we'll send you all a copy of this photo. Wal, you're a star. Thank you for having the patience to wait 25 years for General Fusion to actually start producing electricity, and that you invested that long. I mean, I wish all investors had that patience, and nurture these companies. And also your focus on, we have to take a look at the big picture and stay focused. So thank you very much for all of the hard work that you're doing. Thank you for taking the time. And again, my apologies to everyone about me screwing up on the time, but we will send you the replay. Wal, stay well, and I hope to see you soon.
Robert, thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. You were great. You were great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you all for coming, and I'll send everybody a copy of the tape. Again, my apologies for I completely lost track with the time getting changed in the Netherlands.